A German prospector stands in the African heat in 1871, staring at walls that should not exist. Walls taller than houses, curved in perfect arcs, granite stacked so precisely you cannot slide a blade between the stones. And instead of asking how the people before him built this, he asks who else must have built it. Because in his mind, Africans could not have done this. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand how these stones became more than architecture, how they became a threat to empire itself, and how a city called Great Zimbabwe was powerful enough that history tried to erase its builders. Before explorers, before colonial maps, before denial, there was a city alive with movement. Between roughly the 11th and 15th centuries, on a high plateau in southern Africa, granite outcrops were split and shaped by hand, block by block, until they formed walls that still defy modern assumptions. No mortar binds them, no cement holds them together. Gravity and skill alone have kept them standing for nearly 1,000 years. And when you walk those walls today, you don't feel mystery, you feel intention. The curves are deliberate. The entrances narrow and widen strategically. The passages guide your body the way authority guides a population. This was not decorative ambition. This was statecraft in stone. At its height, the city supported a population that likely reached into the tens of thousands. That means food production on a massive scale. Sorghum fields, cattle herds, storage systems capable of sustaining surplus. It means political hierarchy. It means coordination of labor so complex that thousands of granite blocks could be quarried, transported, and placed with structural precision without collapsing inward. The great enclosure alone rises more than 30 feet in places, its outer walls sweeping in a massive curve that feels less like a boundary and more like a declaration. We organize, we command, we endure. Above the valley, the hill complex crowns the landscape. From that elevation, elites could survey the settlement below. Ritual space intertwined with political authority. Down in the valley, homes built of earth and timber clustered around daily life, cooking fires, weaving, metalwork, negotiation, birth and burial. The stone was reserved. It marked power. It separated sacred and administrative authority from ordinary space. Architecture became hierarchy, made visible. And this was not an isolated inland settlement surviving on its own narrow resources. The wealth of this kingdom moved outward. Gold extracted from the surrounding region traveled toward the Swahili coast, entering the vast trade networks of the Indian Ocean world. Ivory, too. In return came imported goods, glass beads, ceramics, objects that trace roots stretching to Arabia and Asia. This inland African capital was connected to global exchange centuries before European colonization. It was not waiting to be discovered. It was already integrated. That integration is what makes the later denial so revealing. When European explorers reached these ruins in the 19th century, they confronted evidence that contradicted the racial ideology underpinning colonial expansion. If Africans had built monumental stone cities, organized long-distance trade, and governed complex societies centuries earlier, then the claim that Africa lacked civilization before European arrival began to fracture. The walls forced a choice: revise the ideology or deny the builders. Many chose denial. Theories appeared almost immediately: Phoenicians, Arabs, biblical figures, lost white civilizations. Anyone but the Shona ancestors whose descendants still lived in the region and whose oral traditions preserved memory of the stone houses. The architecture became politically inconvenient. It stood as physical proof of African statehood long before colonial rule, and that proof threatened the moral justification of empire. But the stone did not cooperate with fantasy. Archaeological excavation in the 20th century revealed local construction techniques, local material sourcing, settlement patterns consistent with regional culture, and artifacts aligning with indigenous timelines. The engineering matched African traditions. The chronology matched African history. The evidence did not bend. And yet, even when science corrected the record, politics resisted. During white minority rule in Rhodesia, acknowledging indigenous authorship undermined the narrative of European superiority. Publications were restricted. Interpretations were monitored. Archaeology itself became a contested space, because the past had present consequences. Stand inside those walls again in your mind. Feel the weight of granite stacked by hands that understood geometry through experience, not textbooks. Imagine the city alive. Cattle moving through dust, gold weighed and negotiated. Leaders holding council above the valley. Rituals unfolding within enclosed stone. This was sovereignty, expressed in architecture. This was African urban complexity, centuries before colonial maps drew borders across the continent. And the most powerful truth of all is this: the city never needed foreign architects to explain it. The denial came later. The builders were always here. Long before a single European chronicler tried to explain these walls away, gold was already moving through them. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear it. Not the clink of coins, but the soft shift of dust poured from leather pouches, weighed in careful hands, guarded not for ornament, but for influence. Great Zimbabwe did not rise in isolation. It rose because it understood value. Inland, far from the ocean, this capital sat at the center of something larger than its skyline, something that connected granite hills to monsoon winds thousands of miles away. The city did not need to see the sea to shape it. The goldfields of southern Africa fed into networks that reached eastward toward the Swahili coast, where port cities like Kilwa flourished as intermediaries between inland producers and Indian Ocean merchants. From those ports, ships caught seasonal winds toward Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond. The monsoon was predictable. The trade became predictable with it. And at the beginning of that chain, before caravans set out and before sails filled, authority rested here. Control the gold before it left the plateau, and you controlled negotiation before it reached the coast. Archaeological excavations at Great Zimbabwe have uncovered glass beads and fragments of imported ceramics that did not originate in southern Africa. These are not decorative curiosities. They are physical proof of exchange. Every shard that traveled inland represents an agreement made somewhere along a route that required trust, structure, and continuity. Trade of that scale does not happen accidentally. It depends on political stability and economic organization strong enough to guarantee supply. This is what transforms the stone from spectacle into system. The walls of the great enclosure are not just symbols of ritual or defense. They are expressions of accumulated wealth and coordinated labor. You cannot sustain monumental construction without surplus. You cannot maintain surplus without production. And you cannot maintain production at scale without governance. The cattle herds that defined status and wealth required pasture management. Agriculture required seasonal planning. Gold extraction required labor organization and oversight. Everything interlocked. The hill complex rising above the valley begins to feel different when you see it this way. It is not simply elevated for drama. It is elevated because power watches movement. Movement of people, of goods, of authority. The separation between stone architecture and earth-built dwellings reflects hierarchy grounded in access. Those who controlled trade occupied space differently from those who sustained daily production. Architecture made that hierarchy visible. And here's the deeper point. Great Zimbabwe was not waiting for global integration. It was already integrated into a medieval commercial world that spanned continents. The presence of imported goods at the site aligns with known Indian Ocean trade networks that linked East Africa to wider markets centuries before European colonization reached the interior. This was not accidental contact. It was structured participation. By the 15th century, regional trade dynamics shifted and political centers moved northward. Cities evolve, influence migrates. Great Zimbabwe's prominence declined as part of a broader pattern of change. But decline does not negate complexity. It confirms it. Urban centers rise when trade routes align with power. They shift when those roots change. And that is why the later colonial denial becomes so telling. Because once you recognize Great Zimbabwe as a functioning capital embedded in long-distance exchange, the idea that it required foreign architects collapses. Its development aligns with regional cultural evolution. Its trade aligns with documented Indian Ocean systems. Its construction techniques align with local traditions. The evidence forms a coherent story. The city was not mysterious to those who lived in its shadow. It only became mysterious to those unwilling to credit its builders. Gold left these hills quietly. Imported goods returned just as quietly. Authority sat above it all, confident enough to build in stone. And centuries later, when empire arrived and confronted these walls, it was not facing ruins, it was facing proof. The first European to write about the ruins stood among the walls and searched for a familiar story, not an accurate one. In 1871, the German explorer Karl Mauch walked through the granite corridors of Great Zimbabwe and decided that what he was seeing could not belong to the people who lived nearby. The walls were too high, the masonry too deliberate, the scale too imposing. So instead of asking how a Shona kingdom had organized the labor to build them, he reached for something biblical. He suggested links to ancient Phoenicians. He speculated about King Solomon. He described cedar beams that were not cedar at all. The stone did not match his worldview, so he tried to make the world match the stone. This was not a minor misunderstanding. It set a tone. By the late 19th century, southern Africa was not merely a landscape of exploration. It was a landscape of colonization. The British South Africa Company moved north under imperial ambition, and the territory that would become Rhodesia required a narrative to justify its seizure. If Great Zimbabwe could be framed as the work of outsiders, ancient Mediterranean traders, lost white civilizations, biblical wanderers, then colonial rule could present itself not as conquest, but as return. The ruins became politically useful, and so denial hardened into doctrine. European writers and administrators insisted that Africans could not have engineered such precision in dry stone construction. They pointed to the curved walls as evidence of foreign genius, rather than local tradition. They dismissed oral histories that linked the site to Shona ancestors. The presence of imported goods was twisted into proof of external authorship instead of proof of trade. Instead of revising their assumptions, They revised the past. But archaeology does not bend easily to ideology forever. In the early 20th century, systematic excavations began to challenge the fantasy. Stratigraphy revealed construction phases consistent with regional development. Pottery styles matched local cultural sequences. Radiocarbon, dating aligned occupation with medieval African timelines. There was no evidence of Phoenician scripts carved into stone, no Mediterranean artifacts buried beneath the walls. The material record pointed consistently to indigenous builders. This is where the story turns from ignorance to resistance. Because once the scientific case strengthened, the denial required maintenance. During the period of white minority rule in Rhodesia, acknowledging that Great Zimbabwe was built by African ancestors threatened the ideological foundation of colonial governance. If Africans had created complex urban states centuries before European arrival, then the argument that colonial rule brought civilization weakened. Historical interpretation became political terrain. Publications were monitored. Interpretations were discouraged if they emphasized indigenous authorship too strongly. Archaeologists who pushed too directly against the colonial narrative faced professional consequences. The ruins were not only ancient, they were dangerous. Stone became subversive, and all the while the walls stood exactly as they had for centuries. Curved, silent, structurally confident. They did not need defense. They needed recognition. The denial of African authorship was not born from a single conspiracy meeting in a dim room. It was born from a worldview that could not accept evidence without unraveling itself. The architecture contradicted the racial hierarchy that empire depended upon. So empire tried to reposition the architecture, but granite does not negotiate. Each excavation layer reinforced what local memory had never abandoned. This was the work of ancestors rooted in this soil. The chevron patterns, the quarry marks, the spatial planning, all of it aligned with regional cultural evolution. The city did not appear suddenly. It grew, and by the mid-20th century, the weight of evidence became too heavy to ignore. The lie did not collapse overnight. It eroded, because when you strip away the mythology and return to the stone, the question changes. It is no longer, who else built this? It becomes, why were we so determined to believe Africans did not? That question carries consequences far beyond archaeology, and those consequences were about to reshape the name of an entire nation. By the 1960s, the argument over who built Great Zimbabwe was no longer confined to academic journals or museum catalogs. It had become a political fault line. Rhodesia, governed by a white minority regime, depended heavily on a narrative of civilizational hierarchy to justify its continued control. If the land could be portrayed as historically underdeveloped before European arrival, then colonial rule could present itself as stewardship. But Great Zimbabwe stood in silent contradiction to that story. Its walls a medieval testament to organized African statehood, long before empire planted its flag. When professional archaeologists began publishing clearer evidence that the site was constructed by ancestors of the Shona people, the reaction was not purely scholarly disagreement. It was resistance. The implications were too large. Acknowledging indigenous authorship meant acknowledging indigenous sovereignty, not just in the past, but symbolically in the present, and in a territory where power rested in minority hands. That acknowledgement carried weight. Interpretation became carefully watched territory. Findings that reinforced African authorship were treated cautiously, sometimes even discouraged in public framing. The ruins were still promoted as a spectacle, still photographed and admired, but the story attached to them remained politically sensitive. History was no longer about understanding the past. It was about controlling the present. Yet the evidence continued to accumulate. Radiocarbon dating confirmed occupation phases between the 11th and 15th centuries. Material culture, pottery styles, construction techniques, settlement patterns aligned consistently with regional Shona traditions. The trade goods found on site reinforced integration into Indian Ocean networks without suggesting foreign architectural authorship. The story was coherent. It did not require imported genius to explain indigenous achievement. Meanwhile, across southern Africa, movements for independence were gaining force. Colonial authority was being challenged not only with protest, but with historical reclamation. Great Zimbabwe's meaning began to shift. It was no longer merely an archaeological site. It became a symbol, a reminder that African governance, economic organization, and monumental construction were not colonial gifts, but ancestral inheritances. When Rhodesia's white minority government declared unilateral independence in 1965, the tension intensified. The country's very identity was contested, and so was its past. To African nationalists, Great Zimbabwe was proof of continuity, a lineage interrupted by colonization, but not erased. To the regime, the site remained complicated, admired, but ideologically inconvenient. And then, in 1980, the shift became official. The country was renamed Zimbabwe. That decision was not aesthetic, it was declarative. It placed the medieval capital at the center of national identity. The Zimbabwe bird sculptures, carved from soapstone and found among the ruins, became national symbols. The stone that had once been denied African authorship was now the foundation of a sovereign state's name. There's a quiet power in that reversal. For decades, the ruins had been used to question African capability. Now, they affirmed it. The narrative that once sought to displace the builders collapsed under the weight of evidence and political change. Great Zimbabwe became recognized internationally as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, acknowledged not as a mystery, but as a monumental achievement of African civilization. The walls never moved. The interpretation did, and perhaps that is the deepest lesson embedded in the granite. History can be distorted, delayed, politicized, but if the evidence is solid enough, it endures. Great Zimbabwe outlasted empire. It outlasted denial. It became not only a relic of medieval statehood, but a cornerstone of modern identity. The stone that once threatened colonial ideology now anchors national pride, and that transformation was not inevitable. It was earned. Stand on the hill at Great Zimbabwe in the late afternoon, when the light turns the granite almost bronze, and the shadows stretch long across the valley, and it becomes difficult to separate past from present. The walls no longer feel like ruins. They feel like continuity. Generations have walked these paths. Medieval elites overseeing trade, colonial officials measuring and mislabeling, archaeologists brushing dust from pottery shards, independence leaders invoking ancestral strength, and through all of it, the stone has remained exactly what it was. Evidence. What changes is not the granite. It is the story told about it. For centuries, Great Zimbabwe functioned as a capital, an inland center of political authority and economic coordination whose influence radiated outward through gold routes and cattle networks. Then it declined, as cities do when trade patterns shift and power relocates. It did not vanish in catastrophe. It transformed, absorbed into memory and oral tradition. Its descendants did not forget it. They did not need written archives to preserve its presence. Then empire arrived and attempted to dislocate that memory, to rewrite authorship in order to secure political dominance. That distortion lasted decades. It shaped textbooks, museum displays, and colonial rhetoric. It told a generation that the stone could not belong to them, but the stone resisted interpretation that ignored evidence. Archaeology did not give the site back to African history. It confirmed what local knowledge had long sustained. Radiocarbon dates, material culture, spatial analysis, none of it required imported architects to make sense. The city was coherent within its regional context. Its engineering was local. Its economy was integrated. Its decline followed historical logic. The correction was not emotional. It was empirical. And when Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980 and chose its name from this site, the act was more than symbolic pride. It was reclamation of narrative authority. It asserted that the past had been misrepresented and that the correction mattered. The Zimbabwe bird, once displayed as artifact, became emblem. Granite became identity. Yet even this ending resists simplicity. Great Zimbabwe is not proof that history moves in a straight line from denial to justice. It is proof that interpretation carries power. The site still faces modern pressures. Conservation challenges, tourism impact, political symbolism. The work of preservation continues, not only of stone, but of context. If you walk through the great enclosure now, you might hear tourists whispering about mystery, or guides explaining construction methods, or children learning that their country carries the name of this place. And somewhere between those voices is the quiet truth. The walls never needed foreign validation. They needed recognition. The most remarkable part of Great Zimbabwe is not that it survived. It is that it endured distortion without losing coherence. It reminds us that architecture can outlive ideology, that evidence can outlast narrative, and that a civilization's legacy does not disappear simply because someone tries to misattribute it. In the end, the stone does what it has always done. It stands.